Learned helplessness, a terrifying psychological phenomenon. Patty Hearst, a wealthy heiress, was kidnapped by a militant group known as the Symbionese Liberation Army. At first, she resisted fiercely. She was beaten, locked in a dark closet, and isolated for weeks. But then, something chilling occurred. Months later, she was seen holding a gun, robbing a bank alongside her captors. The world was stunned. How could someone transition from being a victim to willingly committing crimes with the very people who had tortured her? This wasn't just a hostage situation. It was a textbook case of psychological breakdown. It all begins with breaking a person down. When someone is placed in a situation where they endure repeated punishment, failure, or isolation, their mind adapts in a deeply disturbing way. They stop seeing escape as an option, even when the door is wide open. They don't run. This isn't just a theory, it's a psychological reality. Psychologists first uncovered this phenomenon in an experiment with dogs. The animals were placed in cages with electric floors. At first, the dogs tried to escape, but after being shocked repeatedly with no way out, they gave up. Here's the terrifying part. When the cage door was finally opened, they still didn't leave. They had developed learned helplessness. This is what keeps victims of manipulation trapped, even when a way out exists. How does this happen to people? It starts with unpredictable rewards and punishments. One day the captor is kind, the next they're cruel. The victim never knows what to expect. Their brain becomes stuck in survival mode, too exhausted to fight back. Then comes self-doubt. The manipulator chips away at the victim's ability to think for themselves. They're told they're weak, foolish, and incapable. Slowly, their confidence erodes to nothing. Eventually, they begin to believe they need their abuser to survive. Next is isolation. Friends, family, and outside perspectives are all cut off. Without anyone to remind them of who they were before, their world shrinks. Their thoughts become controlled by their captor. Finally, there's forced dependence. The victim relies on their abuser for food, shelter, and even basic human connection. By this stage, they might not just accept their captivity, they might defend it. Just like Patty Hearst, they don't just stay, they become active participants in their own entrapment. This is why people remain in abusive relationships, why prisoners of war form emotional bonds with their captors, and why high-control groups keep their members submissive. It's not weakness, it's not stupidity, it's survival. The brain prioritizes safety over freedom. When someone is trained to believe escape is impossible, they won't even try. And that's what makes learned helplessness so terrifying. The most dangerous thing a manipulator steals isn't someone's freedom. It's their belief that freedom was ever possible in the first place. This is the essence of Stockholm Syndrome, a haunting reminder of how fragile the human mind can be under extreme psychological pressure. Love bombing, the illusion of perfect love. Attention is intoxicating, the affection is overwhelming. You finally found someone who sees you, truly sees you. They flood you with compliments, send constant texts, and tell you how special you are. They claim they've never met anyone like you. It's intense, exhilarating, and almost too perfect. And that's because it is too perfect. This is love bombing, a psychological tactic designed to make someone emotionally dependent before pulling the rug out from under them. It's not about genuine affection. It's a setup, a carefully crafted illusion. Love bombing works by hijacking the brain's reward system. When someone floods you with extreme positivity, your brain releases dopamine, the same neurotransmitter involved in addiction. It's a high, an emotional rush that feels impossible to walk away from. And that's exactly the point. In romantic relationships, it might look like extravagant gifts, rushing into intimacy, or intense declarations of love after only a few days. In friendships or workplaces, it's an instant connection, relentless praise, and flattery that feels almost surreal. But the real trick isn't in the excess, it's in the reversal. Once the victim is hooked, the withdrawal begins. The good morning texts stop. The warmth fades. The compliments turn into cold indifference, or worse, criticism. Suddenly, the person who made you feel like the most special person in the world pulls away, leaving you scrambling to understand what went wrong. And here's where the real manipulation happens. Instead of recognizing the pattern, the victim blames themselves. They analyze every conversation, lower their boundaries, and work harder to fix what they think they did wrong. They chase the affection, not realizing that the honeymoon phase was never real to begin with. This cycle, intense affection followed by sudden emotional starvation, is a psychological trap. It's called intermittent reinforcement, the same mechanism that makes gambling so addictive. The victim never knows when the affection will return, so they keep chasing it, tolerating worse and worse treatment, just for another hit of that early euphoria. It's a tactic used by narcissists in relationships, by cult leaders to keep followers obedient, and even by toxic workplaces to manipulate employees into loyalty. The unpredictability creates an emotional roller coaster, where the victim is so focused on regaining the high that they don't realize how much control they've lost. By the time they see the pattern, it's already too late. They're exhausted, isolated, and doubting their own instincts. Guilt tripping, gaslighting, and emotional manipulation are tools of control. No force is needed. The victim, desperate to reclaim the love and validation they once received, becomes trapped in a cycle of dependency. Love bombing isn't love. It's a calculated strategy to dominate, leaving the victim questioning their worth and clinging to the hope of recapturing a feeling that was never real in the first place. Brainwashing, the invisible chains of the mind. You've seen it before, people so brainwashed that they seem completely disconnected from reality. They believe the unbelievable, defend the indefensible, and reject even the most obvious truths. But how does someone get to this point? What exactly is brainwashing, and what are the practical steps that make such a radical transformation possible? Brainwashing isn't just an idea from dystopian fiction. It's one of the most powerful and effective psychological manipulations in history. And the terrifying part? No one is truly immune to it. One of the most chilling real-world examples is the Jonestown Massacre in 1978. Over 900 people, including children, died after drinking cyanide-laced punch under the orders of cult leader Jim Jones. This wasn't a group of people who suddenly decided to follow a madman. They were conditioned, step by step, until their critical thinking was completely overridden. They truly believed they were making their own choices. That's the power of brainwashing. It doesn't force you to change. It makes you want to. So how does it actually happen? It follows a pattern: isolation, destabilization, indoctrination, and reinforcement. A process so effective that once it takes hold, escaping feels impossible. The first step is isolation. When you control the information someone has access to, you control their perception of reality. Jim Jones did this by moving his followers to a remote compound in Guyana, cutting them off from outside influences. In everyday life, this happens in media bubbles, extremist groups, and even in toxic relationships where only one perspective is constantly reinforced. The more someone's worldview is shaped by a single source, the less they question it. Next comes destabilization, breaking down a person's mental defenses. This is done through exhaustion, fear, and confusion. Cults use long sermons, erratic punishments, and emotional breakdowns. Governments use constant crisis narratives, making people feel like the world is too chaotic to understand without their guidance. The more mentally drained someone becomes, the more they rely on the manipulator to make sense of things for them. Then comes indoctrination, implanting new beliefs. The key here is reward and punishment cycles. If you conform, you're praised. If you question, you're punished. In cults, doubting the leader means exile. In real life, questioning certain ideologies can get you socially ostracized. Over time, this conditioning rewires the brain, making the new belief feel natural, even when it was forced upon you. Finally, there's reinforcement. Once brainwashing is complete, the new identity is constantly reinforced through rituals, groupthink, and identity-based loyalty. People stop questioning because their beliefs are now tied to their sense of self. They don't feel brainwashed, they feel enlightened. And that's the scariest part. Brainwashing doesn't feel like brainwashing when it's happening to you. It feels like truth. That's why people stay in abusive groups, fall for mass manipulation, and follow ideologies to extremes without ever questioning them. So how do you protect yourself? The first step is awareness. Brainwashing works by making critical thinking feel unnecessary or even dangerous. The moment you feel pressured not to question something, that's a red flag. The second step is exposure to multiple perspectives. If you only ever hear one side of a story, you are being controlled, even if you don't realize it. And the third step? Pay attention to emotional manipulation. Fear, guilt, outrage. These are the tools used to override logic. Whenever your emotions are being used to shape your beliefs, stop and ask yourself, who benefits from me thinking this way? Because once your mind is rewritten, you won't even realize it happened. And speaking of manipulation, let's talk about love bombing. At first, it feels like something out of a movie, the kind of attention and affection that sweeps you off your feet. But as we've seen, not everything that glitters is gold. Gaslighting, the invisible war on your mind. What happens if someone keeps telling you that you're insane? At first you'd reject it. You know who you are, you trust your own mind. But over time, something shifts. Maybe you are a difficult person. Maybe you do overreact. Maybe you're not as rational as you thought. And if enough doubt creeps in, you might start believing the one thing you never thought possible. Maybe they're right. This is gaslighting, a psychological weapon designed to make you question your own perception of reality. It's not just lying, it's erasing truth itself and replacing it with something more convenient for the manipulator. And the worst part, by the time you realize what's happening, if you ever do, you're already trapped. The term comes from the 1944 film Gaslight, where a husband slowly convinces his wife that she's losing her mind. He dims the lights in their home, then denies that anything has changed when she notices. The goal? To make her doubt herself so completely that she becomes dependent on him. But this isn't just a movie trope. It's a real-world manipulation tactic used in toxic relationships, cults, politics, and even corporations. Gaslighting works because it destabilizes reality itself. It starts subtly. The manipulator denies things they've said or done, even when there's proof. "I never said that. You're making things up." At first you argue back, but over time, hearing the same denials over and over chips away at your confidence. Next, they attack your ability to think clearly. "You're always so dramatic. You overanalyze everything." Soon, you start doubting your own judgment, convincing yourself that maybe you are the problem. Then comes emotional manipulation. Any reaction you have is dismissed. "Why are you so sensitive? You always blow things out of proportion." The goal is to make you question your right to feel the way you do. Eventually, you start second-guessing your own emotions, apologizing when you shouldn't. And then comes the final step: isolation. Gaslighters don't want you hearing outside perspectives, so they slowly cut you off from other influences. They tell you your friends are making you paranoid, that your family doesn't really understand you. Bit by bit, they become the sole authority on what's real. At this stage, they don't need to manipulate you anymore. You do it to yourself. You stop questioning them. You silence your own doubts before they even have a chance to surface. You accept their version of events, not because you want to, but because your mind no longer trusts itself to disagree. Gaslighting is terrifying because it doesn't just manipulate your thoughts, it rewrites who you are. It makes you abandon yourself, handing over control to someone else without even realizing it. And by the time you finally see the truth, if you ever do, it feels impossible to break free. Because how do you fight back when you don't even know what's real anymore? Brainwashing in today's world. We live in an age where information is everywhere, yet truth can feel harder to find than ever. Gaslighting and brainwashing aren't confined to toxic relationships or cults. They're tools used in media, politics, and even advertising. The goal is always the same: to control how you think, feel, and act. The first step to protecting yourself is awareness. Recognize the signs: constant denial of facts, attacks on your perception, and isolation from outside perspectives. The second step is trusting yourself. If something feels off, it probably is. And finally, seek diverse perspectives. The more voices you listen to, the harder it becomes for any one narrative to control you. Because in a world where reality can be manipulated, the most radical act of resistance is to trust your own mind. Cultivating dependence, the invisible chains of control. Cult leaders, abusive partners, and authoritarian regimes rarely use physical chains. They don't need to. The most effective way to control someone isn't to lock them up. It's to make them believe they can't survive without you. This is the dark art of engineered dependence, a psychological trick designed to make people abandon their own independence, willingly handing over control to someone else. And it works because it taps into something fundamental: the human need for connection. It starts with removing options one by one, not through force, but through subtle manipulation. A partner insists your friends don't really care about you. A group warns that your family is toxic and you need to cut them out. A leader whispers, "Only we know the truth. The outside world is dangerous." At first it feels like a suggestion, but soon it becomes a rule, then a belief, until one day you look around and realize there's no one left. Once isolation is complete, dependence takes over. The manipulator becomes the only source of validation, approval, security, even basic needs. They create problems only they can solve. They withhold kindness until obedience is guaranteed. In extreme cases, they control finances, decisions, even movement. The victim stops making choices for themselves, not because they don't want to, but because they've been conditioned to believe they can't. And here's the cruelest part: the victim thinks it's their choice. They aren't locked away, they aren't physically restrained, but they stay because their world has been rewritten so completely that leaving feels like stepping off a cliff. This method has been used throughout history. Cults sever members from friends and family, making the leader their only trusted source of truth. Abusive partners erode self-confidence until their victim believes they are nothing without them. Totalitarian governments censor information, ensuring their citizens feel powerless without the system that controls them. And once someone has been broken down like this, they don't need to be forced to stay. They will choose to. Even when escape is possible, even when the doors are wide open, they hesitate. Because when your identity has been shaped around someone else's control, freedom doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like a threat. Breaking free. The first step to breaking free is recognizing the pattern. If you feel like you're constantly walking on eggshells, second-guessing your decisions, or cutting off relationships to please someone else, it's time to question why. The second step is rebuilding your sense of self. Reconnect with your values, interests, and goals, the things that make you you. And finally, seek support. Whether it's friends, family, or a therapist, outside perspectives can help you see the situation clearly and remind you of your worth. Because the truth is, no one has the right to control your mind, your choices, or your life. The chains of dependence may feel unbreakable, but they're not. Freedom begins the moment you realize you were never truly trapped. You were just made to believe you were. Guilt tripping, the silent puppeteer. Threats don't always come with raised voices. You don't have to argue, persuade, or command. All you have to do is make someone feel guilty. Guilt tripping and shame inducement are some of the most powerful psychological weapons, capable of turning people into puppets without them ever realizing it. The victim believes they're acting out of free will, when in reality, their emotions are being manipulated like strings on a marionette. Think about it. How many times have you done something not because you wanted to, but because you felt bad if you didn't? Maybe you agreed to a favor even though you were exhausted. Maybe you apologized for something that wasn't your fault. Maybe you stayed in a toxic relationship because leaving would make you feel like a terrible person. That's guilt tripping in action, and it's terrifyingly effective. The trick is simple. First, the manipulator plants the seed of guilt, subtly twisting reality to make the victim feel responsible for their suffering. A parent sighs, "After everything I've done for you, this is how you treat me." A friend says, "I guess I just don't matter to you anymore." A partner says, "I sacrificed so much for this relationship, and you're just going to walk away?" None of these statements directly tell the victim what to do. They don't have to. The guilt does all the work. But guilt alone isn't always enough. That's where shame inducement comes in. Guilt makes you feel bad about something you did. Shame makes you feel bad about who you are. It's not "you forgot my birthday." It's "you're a terrible friend." It's not "you made a mistake at work." It's "you're completely incompetent." When someone internalizes shame, they stop fighting back. They don't just feel like they did something wrong. They feel like they are wrong. And that is the ultimate form of control. Cult leaders, abusive partners, manipulative bosses, they all use this tactic to break people down, to make them easier to control. If you can convince someone that they are inherently flawed, that they owe you something, that they are never quite good enough, then they will spend their lives trying to prove otherwise. They will stay in situations they should leave, agree to things they don't want, and chase approval that will never truly be given. But here's the scariest part. Guilt tripping doesn't just come from other people. We learn to do it to ourselves. We hear these voices so often that they become part of our own inner dialogue. I shouldn't say no. I should be a better person. I don't deserve to be happy. And once someone starts shaming themselves, the manipulation is complete. They no longer need anyone else to control them.